come and make some room.
Everywhere I go, I'm in the spotlight. This is a good life. I'm living bold. This is what it looks like. On the tip of the world.
It's December. Can you believe it's already December? And we got through the last few months without anyone saying the supply chain was going to disrupt Santa's arrival. I guess we're back to normal, right? Not quite, right? The pendulum is still swinging. The rates are dropping out. Look, since it's December, we're just going to stick to hitting some of the top stories of the week. There's a lot happening. Let's just keep it light. Keep it informative as we slide into the Christmas holiday. Hi, welcome to By Land and by Sea, an attorney breaking down the week in supply chain, presented by the Maritime Professor, me. I'm Lauren Began, founder of Maritime Professor and Squall Strategies, and I'm your favorite maritime attorney. Join me every week as we walk through both ocean transport and surface transport topics in the wild world of supply chain. As always, the guidance here is general and for educational purposes only. It should not be construed to be legal advice, and there's no attorney-client privilege created by this video or this podcast. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. So usually before we get into the discussion of the day, we go through my top 3 stories of the week. But this month, every week, we're going to be showcasing top stories of the week. So settle in as we embark on the Captain's Log edition of By Land and by Sea. So story number 1. As always, we're watching the Federal Maritime Commission closely for the release of any movement on any of the open 3 rulemakings or the one request for information that's open. We haven't seen much movement in a while, although the RFI is the most recent. But on the rulemakings, we haven't seen a lot of movement in a while. But perhaps today's the day. It's 1 p.m. on a Friday. Not much has happened so far, but you never know. We might still get an announcement by the end of the day. Who knows that? I'm just saying that. I don't know if we actually will. We just are getting off of the holiday of Thanksgiving, so maybe we'll see something in December. I'm done guessing. I thought we were going to see something in September for the detention demurrage. Admittedly, then, though, they had the congressmen submit comments that they had to address. So I don't know. Maybe January, maybe December. Who knows? Maybe December. But remember, so let's kind of recap what's going on here. So the Federal Maritime Commission is working through 3 rulemakings and 1 request for information. They were directed to undertake the rulemakings under the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022. So that's OSRA 2022. So what are the 3 rulemakings that are open? We have defining unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel space accommodations provided by an ocean common carrier. That closed. The supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking closed July 2023. So that, again, remember that was the second open comment period. So they had the initial notice of proposed rulemaking on that. That closed last fall, 2022. And then we opened it back up and had July 2023 as their supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking. Chairman Maffei famously noted, because I say it all the time on here, famously noted that it's more important to get it right than get it fast. And so that was the justification for taking their time on the unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate. I've talked about that rule before. I encourage everybody to go take a look at it, even if you think that it doesn't really apply to you. There's some definitions in there that I think everybody should at least be making sure they're paying attention to, weighing in on, and kind of applying to your situation as a stakeholder in the supply chain. Are the definitions capturing the things that you cover accidentally? Are they capturing how you think it should be, how you think it is? Check out those definitions. Check out the rule generally. Like I said, even if it doesn't fully apply to you, make sure that we're paying attention to that one. The other rule that I think a lot more people are paying attention to, well, definitely a lot more people are paying attention to, is the billing practices of detention demurrage. This last comment period closed December 2022, so about a year ago. We're about 2 weeks away from 1 full year since the comment period closed. They had over 180 comments on this, so I said it was going to take a while. At the time, there were people calling for the final rule to maybe come out in the spring or maybe the summer. I thought maybe we might get there, but 180 comments, that's a lot of comments to go through. But then there was a late filed comment that came in, August, September, just a few months ago. So this comment was important because it came from the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee members, Congressman Jake Auchincloss from Massachusetts and Congressman Brian Babin from Texas. So the FMC received that late filed comment. They accepted it. The FMC kind of is very friendly in accepting late filed comments in general, which is great because really it's not about the timing of when to cut it off, but they want to hear from the stakeholders. And so if it takes a little bit longer to get some of that information in, the FMC has very kindly accepted late filed comments. And certainly they're going to accept probably late filed comments from congressmen on the House committee that oversees their budget. So this came in from these two congressmen. There was actually an ex parte communication posting that mentioned from the FMC saying that the chairman met with one of the two congressmen, Congressman Auchincloss, on October 25th, 2023. So there is a little bit still moving here. Not that we're seeing any fine language out of this, excuse me, but that the FMC is still kind of working on this, and there's a little bit more visibility on the FMC's work here. So from the ex parte communication, they posted it. The FMC posted it under the regulations.gov under their documents section. So it's no longer, it was initially published under the comments section. Now it's under the FMC document, agency document section. But essentially from the ex parte communication notice that the FMC posted, they said of the things that they were talking to Congressman Auchincloss about. So they said that they were talking about his belief in the importance of the incentive principle as it relates to the reasonableness of demurrage and detention charges. The FMC has pretty clearly, I say pretty clearly because they've released some press releases and news releases saying to the industry to pay attention to the Evergreen case, which is a case where basically the FMC through a through their process, it was a informal process, determined that the detention demurrage being assessed over a weekend or a holiday was contrary to the incentive principle. That's paraphrasing what the FMC was essentially saying. Granted, it was a case, so there were specific fact patterns that are involved. But that was kind of what they were saying, is pay attention to this case. We're kind of saying incentive principle does not, the incentive principle is counter to having charges happen over holidays or weekends when you really can't go pick up your goods, right? That was the whole point. It's not incentivizing the movement of the goods because you can't go get it. So why would you be charging because you can't go get it? Nobody can pick it up. The place is closed if it's a holiday or a weekend. Congressman Auchincloss is basically saying through the comments that he posted with Congressman Babin that they don't believe that that's what the incentive principle is. They think that having charges of detention demurrage over the weekend is incentivizing movement because it's incentivizing people to get off their butt and go get their stuff on Friday before the holiday or before the weekend happens. So they're saying, look, the incentive principle is not contrary to that thought, and that they think that MTOs, marine terminal operators, or terminals or ports should be able to assess their own detention demurrage as they think. So that's background on what's happening here, right? So this is the ex parte communication posting that the FMC put on the regulations.gov website. The first one is that they said they talked about his belief, so that's Congressman Auchincloss, in the importance of the incentive principle as it relates to the reasonableness of demurrage and detention charges. They didn't say what, that's all they said. They just said his belief. So from the comment that he filed, that's the explanation of what that is. They said that they also talked about his view that he and other colleagues on the subcommittee of Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation did not support versions of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022 that included marine terminal operators as entities to be included in any rulemaking on D&D billing practices. So let's break this down a little bit. So Auchincloss is saying that, look, this is the Senate version that you guys are working off of. And he said that he didn't support any version of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act that included MTO. So he's saying, look, it was discussed, and I said that I and other colleagues of the Subcommittee on Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation did not support having MTOs included in the rulemaking on D&D. The next line down, it said the Senate excised in its version of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022 language that included MTOs in a rulemaking. So he's saying, look, even though I'm on the House side, I didn't support including MTOs, but I'm telling you the Senate side also had it initially in and then took it out. They took out MTOs in a rulemaking addressing demurrage and detention billing practices mandated under the legislation. So a little bit of history here. Remember when the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022 was kind of making its moves all around? It was the spring of 2022. Things started to heat back up. Are we going to have an OSRA? Yep, we got an OSRA. It came out June 16th, 2022. But what was happening during the spring was initially the House was really pushing for this OSRA language. They had the version that was starting to move, really in 2021. Come spring of 2022, the House version starts to fall behind, and the Senate version actually is the one that rises to the top. And ultimately, it was mostly the Senate version that found its way as the authorizing language of what ultimately became the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022. So they didn't use the House version, they used the Senate version. Auchincloss here is saying, look, in the House version, I didn't support any language that MTOs should be included in the rulemaking. And the Senate version, that was the basis for the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022, excluded MTOs from the proposed rule. So he's saying, look, they shouldn't be anywhere near this rule, is kind of what he's getting at. And this, again, is the report of what the FMC talked about with Auchincloss in this ex parte communication. Number 5, they said that marine terminal operators, MTO, should choose whether to charge demurrage. That's what the FMC is saying. Auchincloss mentioned in their meeting. The MTO should choose whether to charge demurrage. So he's kind of saying, look, the FMC shouldn't be telling MTOs when they shouldn't be charging demurrage. The MTO should get to choose whether to charge demurrage. And then 6, the FMC is reporting that Auchincloss said that the concerns expressed in the correspondence submitted and in the disclosed meeting are bipartisan. So Congressman Auchincloss is a Massachusetts Democrat. Brian Babin is a Texas Republican. So initially, from that comment that was received by the FMC, late filed comment by the FMC, it was bipartisan. And then even though they were only meeting with Auchincloss during this ex parte communication, it was mentioned, or it was expressed, that this was also a bipartisan discussion. So, things are happening, right? Things are happening with the detention demurrage rulemaking. We're just not seeing any final language yet. So I think this is going to be interesting, because where perhaps MTOs were going to be included in the rulemaking previously, they're gonna have to have a discussion. They're gonna have to have a pretty lengthy discussion in the final rule, or the kind of explanatory piece of the final rule, talking about whether or not they included, ultimately what they decide to do here, whether or not they included MTOs. Maybe, especially if they were determining that MTOs should be included based on the comments that came in, and I don't remember what way that comments were leaning. If the FMC looked like they were going to be including MTOs in the final language, it's possible. I don't know if this is going to happen, because they really, I don't think, want to delay this anymore. But as Chairman Maffei said, getting it right is better than getting it fast. Although I don't know if we're in the category of fast anymore. It's possible that this opens back up for a supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking, strictly on the question of whether MTOs should be included. I'm going to have to go back and look through 180. I'll probably take a sampling of how many comments were talking about MTOs, whether they were for or against MTOs being included, to see if the FMC feels like they had kind of a critical mass of information, and I guess comments, really direct comments on whether MTOs should be included. So this is something to watch. This is something, once the final language comes out, or whether we get a supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking. There is stuff happening here. It's just not necessarily moving faster toward the finish line of a final rule. The other thing is, look, the industry wants these guardrails, I think. The industry went from, you could put detention demurrage charges on a bar napkin and send it across via carrier pigeon, and that's how you found out. It didn't have to say what container, it didn't have to say for how long, it didn't have to say really anything. So OSRA created 13 invoicing requirements, and this detention demurrage billing practices kind of is a little bit more coloring inside the lines of what that means, the 13 invoice requirements, and also who and how and when these detention demurrage billings should happen. the industry is waiting on these guardrails to be implemented so that they kind of can make some fairness decisions, can make some calls in how things should be applied. I think from the last notice of proposed rulemaking, the industry took some of that as suggestion and started to refine some of the practices surrounding detention demurrage. Certainly, when the FMC came out and said that Evergreen should be paid attention to, which, like we said at the outset here, Evergreen was talking about holidays and weekends as being probably not something that should be charged because of the incentive principle. I mean, if the congressmen are saying that that's not the way they read it, I mean, they're not the court, right? They're not the Federal Maritime Commission, but they are congressmen of the subcommittee that oversees the FMC. Maybe that'll change. I don't know. Maybe the FMC is going to have to roll that back a little bit. I don't necessarily see that. I mean, it's their incentive principle to determine, and it's their incentive principle to, I mean, really dissect and apply. So there's probably going to be a little bit more discussion there. Commissioner Dye, in a few hearings back, one of the last FMC commission hearings, said that let's not forget that these OSRA directed rulemakings also included direction to review the antitrust or the incentive principle and create a discussion on that. So there's still work to be done. I think that they feel the pressure, but they also want to get it right, but they feel the pressure. We'll see. I don't know. We'll see. So the third rule that we're still waiting on that really hasn't had a lot come out from it is defining unfair or unjustly discriminatory methods. Still waiting on this language. Still waiting on any language on this, though the FMC said that they included some of this under their unreasonable refusal to deal and negotiate language. So they're saying, look, we didn't not touch this. We did touch it. We put it into the unreasonable refusal to deal and negotiate, which is this third rule is defining unfair or unjustly discriminatory methods. Yes, arguably they captured some of that. There's still some things to capture in a standalone rulemaking here. So I think that they are, especially because they were directed to make this standalone rulemaking, they're still working toward that to release some language that would probably go supplemental notice of, not supplemental. It would probably go notice of proposed rulemaking so that they would have proposed text that the industry can then react to instead of open questions. It'll basically be one step before final rule. So you'll still get your notice and comment period, but it will likely be further along than the D&D. Remember, the D&D went from advance notice of proposed rulemaking, which were the open questions, to then notice of proposed rulemaking. FMC already was doing the advance notice, and then Congress said, you should do a rulemaking on D&D. The FMC was like, well, yeah, we got one open. And then they moved into the notice of proposed rulemaking as directed by Congress. And then we have these three rulemakings, and then we have the request for information. This is the Maritime Transportation Data Initiative. This is coming out of the FMC totally, but out of Commissioner Bensel's office. There's been word that there might be another RFI round coming. So remember, the Maritime Transportation Data Initiative RFI, the first one, was really talking to specific stakeholders and the kind of transfer and dissemination of data. I think that this next one, they were also accepting general comments. I think this next one might be trying to, I don't know. I don't know where it's going to go. Maybe it'll be asking more generalized questions. Maybe that's going to be specific questions. I don't know, but this one is interesting and worth paying attention to as well. I think that the Maritime Transportation Data Initiative is creating some really important conversations in the industry about data dissemination, data exchange, and what that looks like perhaps on a digital scale or a digital side of things, but certainly kind of wrangling that data in the industry and how that can create efficiencies. So that's what we're looking for from the FMC. And even though there's stuff to talk about, there's not a lot to report on new that's coming out. So I'm going to keep watching it, but I'll let you know when I hear different things happening. So story number 2, that was only story number 1. These are pretty beefy stories that, even though we're only covering a few different stories, they're pretty beefy in their coverage. So story number 2, the White House made a bunch of announcements this week about supply chain and initiatives that the Biden administration has either already undertaken or plans to undertake still during his tenure. So one of those is the creation of the Council of Supply Chain Resilience. I want to stop there and just mention, look, resilience comes up quite a bit. And I think that because of all the COVID congestion and kind of the breakdown of these links in the supply chain, although, we often talk about it as a supply chain ecosystem, um, they're really hinging on trying to create better resilience for the overall supply chain. So that's what the Biden administration says that they're doing. They are creating the Council on Supply Chain Resilience. They're convening the inaugural meeting of the White House Council on Supply Chain Resilience, which will advance long-term government-wide strategy to build enduring supply chain resilience. The announcement said that the council will be co-chaired by the National Security Advisor and the National Economic Advisor. So throughout this entire White House announcement, there are quite a few elements of security and defense and those sorts of elements that don't always necessarily get included in general supply chain conversations. So it's almost like a protection of the U.S. supply chain is maybe part of the intention here. So this supply chain Council on Supply Chain Resilience will be co-chaired by the National Security Advisor and the National Economic Advisor, but it will also include the Secretaries of Agriculture, so U.S. Department of Agriculture, U.S. Department of Commerce, Department of Defense, Department of Energy, Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Interior, Department of Labor, Department of State, Department of Transportation, the Treasury and Veterans Affairs, the Attorney General, the administrators of the Environmental Protection Agency and the Small Business Administration, the Directors of National Intelligence, the Office of Management and Budget, and the Office of Science and Technology Policy, the Chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, the U.S. Trade Representative, USTR, and other senior officials from the Executive Office of the President and other agencies. So basically, this is going to be a big council. This is going to be a big council on supply chain resilience where everybody that has anything to do with, kind of U.S. government, that was a pretty big list, is going to be included. So this is going to be interesting to keep watching. I always like to kind of see it a little bit more streamlined, but if you want everybody included that has something to do with it, then that's kind of what they're putting out there. So I'll keep watching that. I want to see what's happening with this Council on Supply Chain Resilience. The announcement also said use of the Defense Production Act to make more essential medicines in America and mitigate drug shortages. So this is where we start to get into some of those defense security type things. They basically were identifying that we need to enable investment in domestic manufacturing of essential medicines, medical countermeasures, and critical inputs that have been deemed by the president as essential to the national defense to mitigate those drug shortages. So this is going to be interesting to watch. Defense Production Act to make more essential medicines in America. Arguably a supply chain issue, but I wanted to highlight that because this is where we start to kind of shift in away from general supply chain, commodity neutral to they are talking about drug shortages. The announcement also talks about new cross-governmental supply chain data sharing capabilities. So the Department of Commerce has a new, and they are saying first of its kind, supply chain center, which will be integrating industry expertise and data analytics to develop innovative supply chain risk assessment tools, and is coordinating a deep dive analyses on select critical supply chains to drive targeted actions to increase resilience. So what I'm hearing is they are creating a supply chain center in the DOC, Department of Commerce. They talk about, look, the center is going to be building broad partnerships. This is going to be kind of, it sounds like at least for this part of the supply chain, and I say this part in innovative supply chain risk assessment tools and coordinating deep dive analyses on select critical supply chains. Department of Commerce is partnering with Health and Human Services to assess industry and import data that can help address foreign dependency vulnerabilities and points of failure for critical drugs. So again, we're seeing drugs come up here, medical drugs come up here. It kind of all circles around resilience, but it's interesting that Department of Commerce will be the supply chain center, but I'm going to be watching that one too. I think that's interesting. We've talked about this before, but this I've seen a lot in the news recently. Department of Transportation's Freight Logistics Optimization Works. So this is FLOW. So FLOW is the public-private partnership that's bringing together U.S. supply chain stakeholders to create a shared common picture of supply chain networks and facilitate a more reliable flow of goods. So DOT has recently been announcing, according to the White House announcement here, that participants of FLOW are beginning to utilize FLOW data to inform their logistics decision making, meaning the data's starting to work, right? So in order to have access, as I understand it, to FLOW, you have to provide data in order to get data. And they are very protective over this data to make sure that the data isn't getting out unnecessarily, that the data is protected. It's a pretty interesting overall initiative, this FLOW initiative. If you're not paying attention to it, definitely start paying attention. This is something to kind of watch, just to see. I mean, this again talks about data moving around, talks about data being used to help avoid bottlenecks, shorten lead time for customers, enable a more resilient and globally competitive freight network through earlier warnings of supply chain disruptions. And so, what they're trying to do with this FLOW, at least in part, is get away from the world of 2021 where no one knew what was going on and everything kind of exploded, or so it felt. The announcement here continues. As the effort continues to mature, DOT will work with the Department of Agriculture, USDA, to increase data transparency for containerized shipments of agricultural products in the United States. Efforts that can help producers and sellers avoid disruptions that can increase food prices. So this goes back to kind of that stabilization, resiliency, but now they're tying it to food, specifically ag products. So probably for, well, export and import, really. They don't identify here, but they are talking about the containerized shipments of ag products. So this will be interesting to see how FLOW continues to morph and really become something that the industry so far seems to like. I think they seem to like this initiative. There were some additional initiatives under this announcement. Those are kind of right up front. But additional initiatives, there were quite a few. I'm just going to highlight a few more here. A new resilience center and tabletop exercises for supply chain disruptions. So this is the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, is announcing the launch of a new supply chain resilience center. So think about that. The Supply Chain Resilience Center is going to be housed under Department of Homeland Security. Okay. All right. I mean, this is starting to bring that supply chain discussion, like I said, into the security side of things. It says, the announcement said, this launch of the Supply Chain Resilience Center, which will be dedicated to ensuring the resilience of supply chains for critical infrastructure needed to deliver essential services to the American people. Remember, Coast Guard is actually housed under the Department of Homeland Security. So near-term priorities will include addressing supply chain risks resulting from threats and vulnerabilities inside U.S. ports. Okay, so that kind of lines up with the Coast Guard being part of that discussion. Near-term priorities addressing threats and vulnerabilities inside U.S. ports. It says, additionally, in 2024, in collaboration with other federal agencies and foreign governments, Department of Homeland Security will facilitate at least 2 tabletop exercises designed to test the resilience of critical cross-border supply chains. This is going to be important because I think previously how the vessel met the U.S. shores was maybe an afterthought. Obviously, ports are immensely important, and I cannot overstate their importance. But I don't think everybody really knew that, right? I don't think everybody was really paying attention. So this is kind of nice to see that they're going to be doing some tabletop exercises, testing resilience of critical cross-border supply chains. Imagine if we didn't have our ports during the beginning of COVID when we needed all that PPE. That's how it was coming in. I mean, there were also flights coming in. But to get the mass quantities that we needed was coming by ocean transit. Remember, 90% of everything moves by ocean transit. So moving along, what else is happening here? So there was a launch of a DOT multimodal freight office. This is something that, although it was it was couched as part of this White House announcement, was something that we've talked about since, 2 years ago, since Congress passed the law, the bipartisan infrastructure law, about 2 years ago saying that there was going to be an Office of Multimodal Freight Infrastructure and Policy. So now the launch is happening, right? DOT, the Department of Transportation, is launching this Office of Multimodal Freight Infrastructure and Policy. The office is responsible for maintaining and improving the condition and performance of the nation's multimodal freight network, including through the development of the National Multimodal Freight Network, review of state freight plans, and the continued advancement of the Flow Initiative in partnership with the Bureau of Transportation Statistics. So, did a little bit of digging. It looks like from the DOT website that this office is not actually a standalone office or like a department similar to MARAD or FAA or any of the other kind of modal administrative offices or departments, I guess. But rather, it looks like this is an office inside of the Office of Secretary of Transportation. So Secretary Buttigieg has kind of a collection of offices under his larger office, the Office of the Secretary. So this office, the Office of Multimodal Freight Infrastructure and Policy, is going to be housed, or at least currently looks to be housed, in the Office of the Undersecretary for Policy at the Department of Transportation. So the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Multimodal Freight Infrastructure and Policy has been announced. It's Allison Dane Camden, and through her role, she's going to be responsible for developing and managing the National Freight Strategic Plan and the National Multimodal Freight Network. She's going to be overseeing the development and updating of the state freight plans, as the White House announcement also said. And most of this is kind of a repeat, but this is on the DOT's website of the office that she will be in, what they're doing. Administering multimodal freight grant programs and establishing procedures for analyzing and evaluating applications for grants under those programs, assisting states in the establishment of state freight advisory committees and multi-state freight mobility compacts, and providing to the Bureau of Transportation Statistics input regarding freight data and planning tools. I mean, this sounds pretty cool. I think that this is good. I think this is going to be kind of bringing together all of those different modes, as the name suggests, right? Multimodal freight, and making sure that there's kind of one place for those conversations to happen. So I like the creation. I like the intention here. I'm going to continue to watch The Office. I think that this is cool. The last thing that I wanted to bring up from the White House announcement, and like I said, these are large stories contained within, this is only our second story of the day. So the last thing I wanted to bring up was the Supply Chain Data and Analytics Summit. So the Department of Commerce is set to convene a diverse array of public and private stakeholders at a supply chain data and analytics summit sometime in 2024. There's not a lot of details about this, but what they say is the key aim of the summit will be to invite expert input into supply chain risk assessment models and tools. The summit will also assess data availability, utility, and limitations, and consider actions to improve data flows. I mean, the main things that I'm getting from this is data is important, right? Supply chain resiliency, a keyword, resiliency is important. And that now they're looking at it with more of an eye toward defense and security. So I think that this is good. I think that we're getting some pretty interesting progress, some pretty good progress. And some of these, I hope we're not getting spread too thin in divvying these around to different agencies. But I think that these are really, really important initiatives, and I think that they're good intentioned. I'm going to keep watching them because I think that there's some really positive potential from all of these. All right, story number 3. Didn't I say December and these captain's logs were going to be quick hits? Well, here we are. Only story number 3. We'll go faster here. The Panama Canal is back in the news. So we've talked about the Panama Canal periodically before. Look, I initially raised it simply as something to watch last spring 23. Not necessarily something to worry too much about, especially back then. Over the summer, it got a little bit more play and mainstream. They were saying, look out for the Panama Canal. This fall, I highlighted an article from Greg Miller of FreightWaves, who released I think it was in August, Shipping Traffic Jam at Panama Canal, Why It's Not a Crisis Yet was the title. And that perfectly summed up what was happening kind of like the end of summer into fall. Well, Greg Miller released another article saying that there's something new to watch and maybe something worth paying a little bit closer attention to. And I tend to agree with him here. So what he's saying is spot rates of medium range product tankers have begun to spike. So medium range product tankers. So product tankers of diesel, gasoline, and jet fuel. So look, we've been talking about the Panama Canal periodically, probably a little bit more frequency recently. They've been announcing that they, in the spring, were reducing their draft limitations. So they were going to 44 feet. And then more recently, which requires a little bit more paying attention, that the actual number of vessel transits was not going to be only dependent on the draft, but it was going to go from sheer numbers of vessels allowed to go through from 36, which was kind of a normal good day, down to 18 by February 1st. So essentially in half. That's something worth starting to pay attention to, and on its own, maybe not get too worried about. But look, there's some more things that are happening kind of around it, and now the bulk side of things is starting to be impacted. And well, look, both of those restrictions, draft and vessel numbers, hurt bulk carriers. Look, they're traditionally heavier, right? They make sense. They're carrying liquids for the most part, and they don't have as high of a priority and or they don't have a reservation like the containerized cargo does, which is why the containerized cargo really hasn't been too impacted and it really hasn't been too much of a concern yet. But Bloomberg recently reported that the Panama Canal Authority will add extra slots, allowing ships to pay big premiums to transit the waterway in a special auction. So that advisory from the Panama Canal Authority says that only vessels that have been waiting 10 days or more will be eligible to participate. So you may remember we recently reported that a Japanese company paid almost $4 million to secure a crossing. I think it was $3.98 million. Now they're turning that into extra slots if you pay big premiums. They're kind of allowing for you to pay to jump the line. I still think that container cargo is probably okay, but I'm starting to get a little bit more nervous. And if there's only 18 slots come February, that's down almost half, like we said. And the bulk carrier vessel queue is starting to build. So those premium auctions for vessel transits are going to start to become a lot more valuable. And I mean, if vessels are paying $4 million to get through, I haven't read how many of those high value extra slots are going to be allowing. Are they going to be in addition to 18? Are they going to be part of the 18? I mean, money talks, right? So if you have some of these vessels that are paying $4 million, I don't know if that's going to be a regular number or if that's going to be the anomaly. But if you have vessels willing to pay extra money to get in and they're going to keep it at 18, right? I can't, that's going to eat into the container cargo availability, right? There's only 18 vessels that are allowed to go through. If that's true, I don't know if they're extra in addition to the 18 or if they're included within the 18, but regardless, there's a finite number is what's being said. So we always talk about this. The more expensive things are to travel, right, to transit, the more expensive things are ultimately for the consumer. We're starting to see the reports realize that on mainstream media saying, look, inflation was tied to these goods costing a lot more to cross over the oceans in 2021. I was saying that at the time, right? I'm not a trained economist, but it makes sense, right? If it was costing more and taking longer time, of course the goods rising was going to cost more to the consumer. So mainstream media is talking about that too these days. But look, as jet fuel starts costing more, right? That's part of the product bulkers that are the product tankers that are getting stuck in these queues. Well, that's definitely going to affect prices. So jet fuel's in the vessel, jet fuel goes into the jets, right? So far, this looks like it's a U.S. exports of refined petroleum products to the west coast of South America. That's what Greg Miller's reporting. And he mentions that alternative routes are really more than twice as long, which means that kind of you're stuck in these lines, right? Until the lines become so long that it's now not twice as long to go around. I don't think we're there yet. Look, I don't know. I think this is actually starting to heat up is basically all I want to say. Look, if we're going to drop down to 18 vessels by February 1, we're only at December 1 now. I think shippers should start paying attention to this if they haven't yet. The Panama Canal is a great transit zone, but they're starting to have things happen drought related, right? I mean, if the lakes can't handle the water required for these lock systems, then that's something. So restriction of vessel type, not necessarily vessel draft, is something worth paying attention to. All right, so story number 4. Bed Bath & Beyond is back in the news. We've talked about them periodically. I just wanted to bring this to your attention. This week, they filed a suit against MSC. We knew that this was coming. This was reported previously in, I think it was a regular case filing, not at the FMC, in regular court, I call it. So far, Bed Bath & Beyond has filed lawsuits against OOCL and Yang Ming and now MSC. With OOCL, it was upwards of $32 million. With Yang Ming, it was alleged $7 million. This new suit is potentially for over $100 million. Though I will say, look, some of the damages include lost profits, and those are often difficult to recover. I mean, even in general, right? At the FMC or elsewhere. So the lost profits can be tough. So those numbers potentially might come down. And these are allegations, right? So that's it. They've brought their allegations. They brought their complaints. They've kind of, Bed Bath & Beyond being they. Bed Bath & Beyond is saying, look, so what's happening here in these cases in general? What Bed Bath & Beyond is being pretty consistent across all three of them in what they're alleging. And what they're alleging is that minimum quantity commitments, MQCs, minimum quantity commitment problems from their service contract commitments. So essentially they're saying that they were pushed to the spot market to pay exorbitant fees despite having a service contract which had pre-negotiated cargo amounts and rates. Okay, let's break all that down. That got a little lingo and that got a little confusing. So service contracts are just that, contracts that determine service between two parties, right? The carrier and the BCO, or the shipper, beneficial cargo owners, the BCO. Essentially, the parties will negotiate how much cargo will be moved over the term of the service contract, whatever that service contract term is, which can be a little squishy because it's not usually on exact dates, like on December 1st, you will move 20 TEU. Usually it's over the term of the contract and of the entire term of the contract, which is usually kind of like like annually tied. Then in turn, there's usually a reduction of a rate in the cargo move, right? That's the benefit. You get a guaranteed amount of cargo and you get a reduced rate for that movement of those cargo. So these are then confidentially filed with the FMC for review and monitoring by the agency to kind of make sure that it's not monopolistic or unfair practices happening. Now, remember, the FMC is not responsible for making sure the companies are good at negotiating. If they negotiate bad deals, that's on them. They're not here to make sure that people are getting great deals and that, like I said, that they're good at negotiating. Look, if you're bad at negotiating, that's on you. But the Federal Maritime Commission, the FMC, is responsible for ensuring fair and non-monopolistic dealings. And so that's why they're filed with the FMC. That's why these service contracts are filed with the FMC. So getting back to the case law. So Bed Bath & Beyond is alleging that each of these carriers in their respective filings did not uphold their minimum quantity commitments. But remember, these are just allegations, and now we get to watch the legal proceedings unfold here. So minimum quantity commitments in these kind of service contract terms don't have a ton of case law behind them. The FMC does not determine breach of contracts. They determine violations of the Shipping Act. And so that's where this is going to get very interesting, because this is alleging violations of the Shipping Act contained within these complaints. And so it's going to be a while, right? The legal proceedings are still unfolding. So the OOCL case was brought by Bed Bath & Beyond. It was filed April 27th. It's still going back and forth with their scheduling order, which only outlines their discovery schedule still at this point. So briefs haven't actually even been assigned dates yet. So the discovery itself doesn't even close until July 10th, 2024. So we're a ways away. They're going to be doing a lot of that behind the scenes discovery work. Yang Ming, which was the second case filed by Bed Bath & Beyond, was filed September 12th. It's also still determining a scheduling order, and it looks like, at least from this initial scheduling order, that Bed Bath & Beyond's brief will be due April 15th, 2024, and the respondent's brief, Yang Ming, will be due May 27th. That might change too, right? That might go back and forth. There might be more discussion over a scheduling order and discovery and all of that. And then since the MSC case was just filed, there isn't a scheduling order yet, obviously. It was just filed, yesterday? It might be a little bit difficult to find in the e-reading room. So remember, under the FMC's website, you can actually go look up these docket filings. This third one against MSC was not necessarily filed with Bed Bath & Beyond in the complainant's name. It is Butterfly. So if you're looking for it, put Butterfly in. It's It's 202-30930-DK-Butterfly-1 Incorporated. So go take a look, go see what the complaint is. Again, minimum quantity commitments is really kind of the gist of what's being determined here. The significance here is that this may create a new area of case law, right? This may, paired with the MCS MSC case that we had talked about way long ago. And there's a few others that are also still pending, right? Most all of these cases that even touch or talk about minimum quantity commitments or service contract requirements, or I guess upholding of service contract commitments, these are still ongoing. They're either on appeal or they're still in legal procedure, just the general legal procedure before any sort of initial decision. It's going to be a while before we get clarity here. That's the trouble with full formal litigation, is that it does take a while. It's going to be a really interesting area to watch. And I think that this is going to, I mean, you never necessarily want ruling from you never want creation from the bench, but you do want ruling from the bench. And I think that that's what the FMC is probably going to be trying to figure out here, is how do we interpret the Shipping Act and all of the Ocean Shipping Reform Acts that have come after it, but how do we interpret the Shipping Act and the violation of the Shipping Act, right? We don't want them creating new regulatory things from case law, although it does shape it's supposed to be interpretation, right? That's what these cases are supposed to be, is interpretation of what is already existing in the laws. All right. Those were just, what was it, 3, maybe 4 stories? That's it. That's all for today. There's a lot going on, but mostly just stuff to watch, right? Just kind of some background information of things that I'm watching. I'm going to keep watching all of these things. We got to get some rule makings out, right? The case law is going to take a while, but hopefully we're going to get some rule makings in the near term. I don't know if near term means 6 months from now or not, but I'll keep watching. I'll keep you all up to date on everything that I see. And as always, the guidance here is general for educational purposes only. It should not be construed to be legal advice directly related to your matter. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. But if you have specific legal questions, feel free to reach out to me at my legal company, Squall Strategies. Otherwise, for the non-legal questions, the e-learning, the general industry information and insights, come find me at the Maritime Professor. If you like these videos, let me know. Comment, like, and share. If you want to listen to these episodes on demand, or if you missed any previous episodes, check out the podcast By Land and By Sea. If you prefer to see the video, they live on my YouTube page, By Land and By Sea, presented by the Maritime Professor. And while you're at it, check out the website, maritimeprofessor.com. So until next week, this is Lauren Began, the Maritime Professor, and you've just listened to By Land and By Sea. See you next time.